Well, hello. I hope you and your family are safe and well. Today, I'd like to share some thoughts on the May 14th devotional reading from Streams in the Desert. It has to do with obedience to God. If you have your book, your Streams in the Desert book, feel free to read along with me. Again, it's the May 14th devotional reading. I'm just going to be reading the first part of it. So the passage is based on Genesis chapter 17, verse 23. On that very day, Abraham did as God told him. Instant obedience is the only kind of obedience there is, for delayed obedience is disobedience. Each time God calls upon us to do something, he is offering to make a covenant with us. Our part is to obey, and then he will do his part to send a special blessing. The only way to be obedient is to obey instantly, on that very day, as Abraham did. I know we often postpone doing what we know to do and later do it as well as we can. Certainly, this is better than not doing it at all. By then, however, it is at best only a partial attempt toward obedience. Postponed obedience can never bring us the full blessing God intended or what it would have brought had we obeyed at the earliest possible moment. What a pity it is how we rob ourselves as well as God and others by our procrastination. Remember, on that very day is the Genesis way of saying, do it now. And when I read the devotional initially this week, I thought about the relatively big things that God calls us to and the need for full obedience. The writer references God's command to Abraham for Abraham to circumcise all the males of his household as a sign of God's covenant with Abraham, and that Abraham's full and total obedience to God's command. And of course, this comes after God's call on Abraham to leave his homeland, his family, and everything he had to go to the land that God promised him. Quite a call, right? But it was, again, a call that Abraham fully and immediately obeyed. And there have only been a couple of times in my life when I have felt God call me to something pretty drastic and very specific that demanded my full obedience. One example of that is when I felt God call me to leave the practice of law and to attend seminary and to go into vocational ministry. When I first heard God's call on my life, I have to be honest, I thought it was rather outlandish and absurd. But upon prayer and discernment with those around me, and of course through God's grace, I was able to be fully obedient to God's call on my life. And I'm so grateful that I was, because I've received blessing upon blessing upon blessing. Blessings that I could never have imagined as a result of following God's call, being obedient to God's call on my life. Yet as I thought more about the devotional this week, I was convicted about the more subtle ways that God calls me to be obedient to God, the more subtle ways God nudges me, and the ways I often fall short in being fully obedient, in living as God calls me to live. And a great example of that popped up for me this week. I was doing some reading in Paul's letter to the Philippians, and it's a passage that is quite familiar to me, and perhaps it's familiar to you as well. It comes from chapter 4 of Paul's letter to the Philippians, beginning in verse 4, when Paul writes this: "Rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say rejoice. Let your gentleness be known to everyone. The Lord is near. Do not worry about anything, but in everything, by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus." And this is a passage that is so familiar to me that I tend to often gloss over it. And I tend to look at it and think, oh, that's encouraging and how nice. Yes, I appreciate that and I'm encouraged by it. But this week as I was reading it, I felt God say, no, Ramsey, I want you to obey this. What I'm saying through Paul in this passage. I want you to do what Paul is saying. I want you to rejoice in me. I want your gentleness to be made known. Gentleness is not something these days that is coming quite easy to me, given working at home, homeschooling, the pressure cooker that we've talked about. I want you to know that I am near. I want you to bring everything to me in prayer with thanksgiving, to not worry about anything. And then look at the blessing that God promises that follows. Because when you do this, Ramsey, my peace, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your heart and mind. I've really felt convicted that God is saying, I want you to be fully obedient to me in the little ways, in the little ways I nudge you, just as in the big kind of life up-changing ways, life uprooting ways that we've journeyed through together in the past. So that's my goal this week. My goal this week is to live into these verses and to more fully obey them, to be more open to those subtle ways that God is calling me to fully obey God. And I pray that you will do so as well. Because as this devotional says, on the other side of full obedience is blessing. And not just blessing, but the more we obey God and God's call on our lives in big ways and small ways, the more that we are able to enter into the abundant life that Christ offers to each and every one of us. Abundant life that is marked by love and joy and peace, regardless of our circumstances, regardless of what is going on around us. So that is my prayer for all of us this week. May we more fully obey God and live more fully into the abundant life that Christ longs to give us. Until next week, be safe, be well, and may God bless you.